In 23 years on the bench, I have learned that the most dangerous moment in any courtroom is not when someone is lying. It is when the system is telling the truth, and the truth is not enough. The man who stood before me that Tuesday morning had not stolen anything, had not hurt anyone, had not, in any meaningful sense of the word, done wrong. He had driven home. That was his crime. He had pointed a truck toward the house where his daughter slept, and he had driven. He was wearing the same uniform he had worn for 48 hours straight inside a burning building. His hands were trembling, and the state wanted $380 from him. But that was not what stopped me. What stopped me was the other man in that room. Pressed uniform, perfect posture, a 4-page report with every box checked and every procedure followed, and not a single question asked that had anything to do with the human being standing on the side of the road at 3 a.m. I had both of their files in front of me, and I had something else, something that neither of them knew I was holding. A question, one single question, that I knew, the moment I read that report, would change everything about how this morning ended. When I finally asked it, the courtroom went completely still, because the answer didn't just explain what happened on that road. It put every person in that room, including the officer who filed the complaint, face to face with the kind of truth that procedure was never designed to handle. Stay with me, because what this man said next, I have never forgotten. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. And if stories about justice, empathy, and hidden truths move you, make sure you subscribe to the channel. You won't want to miss what comes next. There are cases I remember not because of their complexity, but because of their weight. Not the legal weight. I've carried heavier files than this one on any given Monday. I mean the kind of weight that settles somewhere behind your sternum and stays there. The kind that follows you home, sits across from you at the dinner table, and watches you pretend to read the newspaper. This was one of those cases. I had been on the bench for 23 years when Daniel Hayes walked into my courtroom. 23 years of watching people stand in that spot, that particular square of scuffed hardwood floor in front of my bench, and I had learned to read a person before they ever opened their mouth. The way they stood, whether their hands were still or restless, whether they looked at me or looked at the floor like the floor might save them somehow. Daniel Hayes looked at the floor, but not the way guilty men look at the floor. Guilty men look down because they are calculating, running the numbers, measuring the distance between what they did and what they can still deny. Daniel Hayes looked down the way a man looks down when he simply has nothing left, when the body has been pushed so far past its limit that even the act of lifting your eyes feels like one more thing to carry. It was a Tuesday morning in early November, the kind of morning that never quite decides to become day. The sky outside the courthouse windows was that flat, colorless gray that presses down on a city like a lid. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed their usual tuneless frequency, washing everything in a yellow that made healthy people look sick and tired people look like ghosts. The courthouse heating system had been struggling for a week. I could feel it, a damp chill that settled into the corners of the room and crept along the floor. The court reporter had her coat still on. The bailiff was on his third coffee. I could smell it from the bench. I watched Daniel Hayes walk to the stand. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, the kind of build that comes from real work, not a gym. But those shoulders were forward, folded in on themselves like something that had been holding a great weight for so long it had simply forgotten how to straighten. He wore his uniform. Not the dress uniform, the work uniform. Navy blue, worn thin at the elbows. A patch on the chest that had been washed so many times the gold threading had gone dull. There was a mark on his left sleeve that no amount of washing had fully reached. A shadow of gray, like smoke that had decided to stay. His hands, when he placed them on the railing in front of him, were trembling. Not violently, just that low, constant tremor that lives in muscles that have been used past their breaking point and haven't yet been told they can rest. And his eyes. I have looked into a great many eyes from this bench. Angry eyes, calculating eyes, tearful eyes, defiant eyes. Daniel Hayes had none of those. His eyes were simply empty. red at the rims, sunk deep into his face, carrying that particular blankness that comes only from profound, extended sleep deprivation. They were the eyes of a man who had been awake so long that the world had started to blur at the edges. He was 38 years old. He looked 60. I picked up the file in front of me. I did not open it yet. I simply held it for a moment, because I have learned over the years that how you enter a case matters. You can decide in the first 30 seconds whether a courtroom is going to be a machine or a room full of human beings. I have always preferred the latter. I looked at him. He was looking at the floor again. "Mr. Hayes," I said. He looked up, slowly, the way a man surfaces from deep water. I held his gaze for a moment and said nothing. Sometimes the most important thing a judge can do is simply look. Not to intimidate, not to evaluate, just to let a person know that there is someone on the other side of that bench who intends to see them clearly. Whatever he expected me to say, I don't think it was what came next. I set the file down. I folded my hands on top of it, and I asked him the only question that had been in my mind since he walked through that door. "Son," I said, "when was the last time you slept?" The question landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. I watched the ripples move. The court reporter's fingers paused above her keys. The bailiff shifted his weight. The prosecutor, a young man named Gerald Fitch, efficient and humorless in the way that certain ambitious people allow themselves to be, looked up from his notes with an expression that suggested he wasn't entirely sure the question was legally relevant. He was right, technically. It wasn't. But I hadn't asked it for legal reasons. Daniel Hayes opened his mouth, closed it, and then did something I had not expected from a man his size, in a room this formal, under these fluorescent lights. He had to think about it. Not for a second, not in the performative way people pause when they want to seem thoughtful. He genuinely had to search his memory for the answer, and the search took long enough that the silence in the room became its own kind of testimony. "Sunday night," he finally said, before the call came in. I nodded slowly. "And today is Tuesday." "Yes, sir." I removed my glasses. I cleaned them with the edge of my robe, a habit my clerk has been gently mocking for 15 years, and I set them back on my face. It is a small gesture, but it gives me a moment, and sometimes a moment is everything. "Mr. Fitch," I said without looking away from Daniel, "please read the charges." Gerald Fitch straightened in his chair with the quiet satisfaction of a man being returned to familiar ground. He lifted his papers and began. The charges, read aloud in a courtroom, have a particular quality. They are designed to be precise, surgical. They describe human behavior the way a mechanic describes a faulty part, without context, without history, without the 1,000 invisible pressures that cause a person to arrive at a specific moment, doing a specific thing. The law, in its written form, does not accommodate exhaustion. It does not accommodate grief or desperation or 48 hours without sleep in a burning building. It accommodates facts. The facts, according to Gerald Fitch, were these. At 3:14 in the morning on November the 9th, a vehicle registered to Daniel James Hayes was observed by Officer Brett Callahan proceeding through a traffic signal in the amber phase at a speed of 54 miles per hour in a posted 40-mile-per-hour zone. Officer Callahan initiated a traffic stop. During the stop, the operator of the vehicle, Daniel Hayes, was found to be without his primary license on his person, producing instead a departmental identification card from the city fire department, which Officer Callahan noted was not a legally recognized substitute for a state-issued driver's license. The operator was asked to exit the vehicle. The operator complied, but during the subsequent interaction, made a statement to Officer Callahan that was recorded in the incident report as verbally aggressive and constituting disrespectful conduct toward a law enforcement officer. 2 citations were issued, combined total $380. Gerald Fitch set the papers down with the neat finality of a man who considers the matter settled. I looked at the amount. $380. I have seen that number mean different things to different people in this room. To some, it is an inconvenience, a dinner out, a weekend trip, a line item to be managed. To others, and I have learned to identify them, the people for whom that number lands like a physical blow, it is rent. It is the electric bill and 2 weeks of groceries. It is a conversation that has to be had at home that nobody wants to have. I looked at Daniel Hayes's hands on the railing. The tremor was still there. "Mr. Hayes," I said, "you are charged with 2 traffic violations and 1 count of disrespectful conduct toward a law enforcement officer." I paused. "Do you understand the charges as read?" "Yes, sir." "Do you have legal representation today?" "No, sir, I couldn't." He stopped, started again. "I couldn't afford it. I figured I'd just come and explain." Just come and explain. 23 years on this bench, and that phrase still does something to me. The faith embedded in it. The almost heartbreaking belief that explanation ought to be enough. That if you simply show up and tell the truth, the system will meet you halfway. Sometimes it does. "You figured you'd explain," I repeated, more to myself than to him. "All right, Mr. Hayes, then explain." Officer Brett Callahan was seated to the left of the prosecution table. Straight-backed, composed, his uniform so crisp it seemed to have its own opinions. He had submitted a 4-page incident report, typed, single-spaced, every procedural box checked with the thoroughness of a man who knew exactly how institutional memory works and intended to be on the right side of it. He had done everything correctly, every single thing, by the letter. He watched Daniel Hayes with the steady attention of a man who is not nervous because he does not believe he has anything to be nervous about. I turned back to Daniel. The fluorescent light above the witness stand buzzed once, briefly, then settled back into its low hum. Somewhere in the building, a door closed. The clock on the wall behind me moved its minute hand with that small mechanical click that, in a quiet room, sounds much louder than it has any right to. "Mr. Hayes," I said, "I have the incident report. I have the citations. I have Officer Callahan's account of what happened on the side of that road at 3 in the morning." I leaned forward slightly. "What I don't have is yours." He swallowed. "So I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to take your time." I held his gaze. "Why did you do it?" He didn't answer right away, and I didn't rush him. In this profession, you learn the difference between a silence that is hiding something and a silence that is simply trying to find the words for something too large to fit neatly into language. Daniel Hayes was doing the latter. I could see it in the way his jaw moved slightly, the way his eyes dropped to his hands and then came back up to me, the way he drew one slow breath through his nose like a man steadying himself before stepping onto uncertain ground. "There was a fire," he said. 2 words, but the way he said them, quietly, without drama, the way people state things that are simply true and have always been true and will always be true, told me more than 2 words should be able to tell a person. "Tell me about the fire, Mr. Hayes." And he did. He told it the way men like Daniel Hayes tell things, without flourish, without self-pity, moving through the details in the practical sequence of someone who is trained to assess situations fast and act faster. A textile warehouse on the east side of the city. The call came in at 11:40 on Sunday night. What appeared initially to be a contained ground floor fire reached the structural supports within the first hour. The crews worked through the night. He told me about the moment, sometime around the 4th hour, he thought, though time had become a loose and unreliable thing by then, when they realized the building's internal layout did not match the blueprints on file. That the 3rd floor had been subdivided without permit, that there were workers up there who had stayed late, that the stairwell they should have used was gone. He stopped for a moment. "We found 2 of them," he said, "a man and a woman. They were in a storage room at the back. They'd pushed towels under the door." He looked at his hands. That's actually the right thing to do. Push fabric under the door, slows the smoke." He said it like he was proud of them for knowing. Like even in that moment, some part of him was still the person who wanted people to know how to survive. "I went in for them," he said. "The ceiling on the east side had already started to go. My partner called for me to wait for backup. I heard him. He paused. "I didn't wait. He brought them out, both of them. The woman was conscious. The man had lost consciousness from smoke inhalation but had a pulse. Both survived. The crew rotated through the night and into Monday night. Fresh units came. The veterans stayed because they knew the building now, knew its moods, knew where it was still dangerous and where it had given up. Daniel stayed. He did not remember making the decision to stay. He said it wasn't really a decision, it was more like the alternative simply didn't occur to him. By the time the fire was fully contained and the site was cleared and the paperwork was done and his captain finally told him to go home, it was past 3 a.m. on Tuesday. He got in his truck. He drove. "I just wanted to get home," he said. "I kept thinking about my daughter. She's 7. When she wakes up in the morning, she always comes and checks if I'm there. She stands in the doorway of our room and just looks to make sure." His voice, which had been steady through all of it, through the warehouse, through the smoke, through the 2 people he carried out of a burning building, cracked almost imperceptibly right there, at the image of a 7-year-old girl standing in a doorway checking that her father was still in the world. I wanted to be there when she looked. The courtroom was very still. I have heard a great many things from that witness stand. Confessions and denials and justifications and lies so elaborate they almost became their own kind of art. But what Daniel Hayes had just given me was something rarer. He had given me the truth in its simplest form, with nothing built around it to make it more palatable or more dramatic. Just the truth. A man who had given everything he had for 2 days straight, trying to make it home to a doorway where his daughter would come to check that he was still alive. "The officer," I said, "tell me what happened." His jaw tightened, just slightly. "I was pulled over," he said. "I wasn't speeding. I mean, maybe a little over, but I wasn't reckless. I was so tired I didn't even notice the light changing." The officer came to the window. I gave him my department ID because I couldn't find my license in my bag right away. My gear was in the back, my bag was disorganized. I'd just come off a 2-day. He stopped, reorganized. He asked me to get out of the car. I got out. He looked at my uniform and he said, Daniel paused. And in the pause I could see that he was deciding whether to say the next thing, whether it was worth it, whether it would help or hurt him in this room. He said I didn't look like any firefighter he'd ever seen. He said I looked like I was coming back from a bar. The room shifted, not loudly, but I felt it. I told him I had just come off a 48-hour shift. I told him there was a warehouse fire on Eldridge. He could check the news. He could call anyone. Daniel's voice was level, but something underneath it had gone tight. He told me that wasn't his problem. He said the law was the law, and it didn't matter what I'd been doing. And then he told me to face the vehicle while he ran my plates. On the side of the road, at 3 a.m, like I was... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. You told him he should be ashamed of himself, I said. Yes, sir. And that is the conduct described in this report as verbally aggressive and disrespectful. Yes, sir. I sat with that for a moment. Then I turned to Officer Brett Callahan. He met my eyes without flinching. I will give him that. He had the posture of a man who had reviewed his own actions and found them satisfactory. He had followed procedure. He had documented everything. He had, by every measurable institutional standard, done his job. Officer Callahan, I said, you filed a detailed report. You checked every box. You cited every code. I paused. Tell me, at any point during that stop, did it occur to you to look at that man and ask a single question that was not procedural in nature? A beat. Your Honor, I was following... I know what you were following, I said. I asked what occurred to you. He had no answer for that, not because he was a bad man, but because the question was one he genuinely had not asked himself. And watching him sit with it, watching the first hairline fracture appear in that perfect posture, I felt not satisfaction, but a deep and familiar sadness, because I have seen it before. The way institutions can train the instinct for humanity right out of a person, so gradually they don't even notice it leaving. I turned back to the courtroom. In 23 years on this bench, I said, and my voice was quiet enough that the room had to lean in. I have never, not once, confused the letter of the law with its spirit. The law exists to protect people, not to punish them for being human. I looked at Daniel Hayes. This man spent 48 hours in a burning building so that two strangers could go home to their families. He drove home on fumes, on pure exhaustion, on the last reserves of a body that had already given everything it had. He crossed an amber light. He could not immediately locate his license. And when a fellow officer of this city treated him like a drunk on the side of the road, he said, correctly, that the officer should be ashamed. I let that land. The citations are dismissed, both of them, in their entirety. I heard the breath Daniel Hayes let out from across the room. Furthermore, I said, turning back to Officer Callahan, I am ordering a formal written apology from Officer Callahan to Mr. Hayes. Not suggested, ordered. It will be documented, entered into the record of this hearing, and copied to the internal review board of this precinct, not as punishment. I held Callahan's gaze, as education, so that the next time a man in a worn uniform is standing on the side of the road at 3 a.m, you remember that exhaustion can look like many things, and that before you decide which one you're looking at, you ask. I raised my gavel. It came down once. The sound of it filled the room completely, and then faded, and the room was quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet than before, the kind that follows something being set right. The courtroom emptied the way courtrooms always do, gradually, then all at once. The prosecutor gathered his papers with the brisk efficiency of a man already thinking about his next case. The stenographer saved her file, pulled on her coat, and was gone before the echo of the gavel had fully settled. The bailiff held the side door open, nodded at me in that particular way he has, not quite a bow, not quite a salute, something in between that I have never asked him to explain, because I think I would miss it if he did. I sat for a moment after the room had cleared. I do this sometimes. Stay on the bench after everyone has left. The building has a different quality then, a kind of held breath, like a theater after the audience is gone but before the crew comes to strike the set. I have made some of my clearest decisions in that stillness, thought through some of my hardest cases, and sometimes I simply sit, because at 67 years old I have learned that stillness is not wasted time. It is the only time that genuinely belongs to you. I thought about Daniel Hayes walking out of that building. I had watched him from the bench as the session closed, watched his shoulders specifically. There is something I have noticed over the years about the way people carry verdicts in their bodies before their minds have fully processed them. The guilty ones often go rigid, bracing for the weight of consequence. The relieved ones do the opposite. Something releases. Something that has been held under tremendous pressure is finally allowed to decompress, slowly, the way a deep-sea creature brought carefully to the surface adjusts to a world with less crushing weight. Daniel Hayes's shoulders, as he turned from the stand, were fractionally higher than when he had walked in. Not straight, not unburdened. A man does not shed 48 hours of exhaustion and a humiliation he didn't deserve in the space of a single morning, but fractionally higher, enough that I noticed, enough that it stayed with me. His wife had been in the gallery. I had seen her when I entered, a small woman in a gray coat, sitting very upright in the second row with her hands folded in her lap, and an expression of controlled anxiety that I recognized immediately as the face of someone who has been worried for a long time and has become very practiced at not showing it. When the citations were dismissed, she pressed both hands briefly over her mouth, just for a moment. Then she lowered them and straightened and waited for her husband to reach her. I did not see them embrace. I was already looking at my notes by then, but I heard it, that particular shift in the ambient sound of a room when two people find each other after something difficult. I have heard it many times. I never stopped being grateful for it. Months passed. In my experience, the cases that stay with you rarely resolve in the courtroom. The courtroom is the hinge, the moment where things begin to turn. What actually changes happens later, quieter, in the ordinary texture of days that never make it into any official record. I learned what I learned about Daniel Hayes the way I learn most things after a case is closed, in pieces, through channels that are entirely unofficial. My clerk, who knows everyone and forgets nothing. The bailiff, who has a gift for hearing things. A note, occasionally, that finds its way to my chambers without any particular explanation. Daniel went back to work 3 days after the hearing. His captain, who had heard about the citation in the way that people in close-knit departments hear about everything, had quietly arranged for the union to cover the legal costs, though of course there were none in the end. His crew gave him a hard time about it, the way that people in difficult professions express affection, with relentless, specific, lovingly crafted mockery. He was apparently referred to for some weeks as Citation Hayes, and he apparently did not mind at all. His daughter, I was told, had indeed been standing in the doorway when he got home that Tuesday morning. He had made it back before she woke up. He was there when she looked. I sat with that piece of information for longer than was probably necessary. As for Officer Brett Callahan, I want to be precise here because it would be easy and dishonest to make him into a simple villain, and I have never been interested in simple villains. He submitted the written apology within the week. My clerk told me it was 4 paragraphs long, which is 3 more than I required, which told me something. Whether it told me he was genuinely contrite or merely thorough, I cannot say with certainty. Probably some combination of both, which is how most meaningful change actually arrives, not as a sudden conversion, but as a slow accumulation of small, reluctant reckonings. The internal review his precinct conducted resulted in a supplementary training module on de-escalation and contextual judgment during traffic stops. It was not named after anyone. It was not announced with any fanfare. It was simply added, quietly, the way real institutional change sometimes happens, when the people inside the institution are more interested in improving it than in defending it. And then, this is the part I return to most often. Approximately 8 months after that Tuesday morning in my courtroom, Brett Callahan was first on scene at a multi-vehicle accident on the interstate. A man had been ejected from his vehicle. The situation was critical. Callahan performed field stabilization and stayed with the man, talking to him, keeping him conscious, until the paramedics arrived. The man survived. The following week, Callahan made a phone call. He called the firehouse where Daniel Hayes worked. He asked for Daniel by name. He told him what had happened. He said, and I have this secondhand, so I offer it as such, that when he was kneeling on the asphalt next to a stranger who might have been dying, he thought about what it meant to be the person who stays, who goes in when others hesitate, who chooses the human being over the procedure. He said he thought about Daniel Hayes. He said he wanted him to know. I do not know what Daniel said in response. That part of the story belongs to them, and I think it should stay there. Some things are not mine to narrate. What I will tell you is this. I have spent 23 years in a room where the law and the human being meet each other, often badly, often under the worst possible circumstances. And what I have learned, what I am still learning, on the days when I sit alone on the bench after everyone is gone, is that justice is not a verdict. A verdict is just a word. Justice is what the word points toward if you are willing to look. It is the moment a man's shoulders rise slightly after being seen. It is a child standing in a doorway looking and finding her father there. It is a phone call that nobody required anyone to make. Those things will never appear in any official record. They will never be cited in any precedent, but they are, in my experience, what the law is actually for, when it is working the way it was meant to work. And when the people inside it remember that it was built for human beings, and that human beings are almost always more complicated and more worthy of careful attention than any incident report can capture. I put on my coat. I turned off the lamp on my bench. I walked out through the side door into a corridor that smelled of old wood and floor wax and decades of difficult mornings. And I went home. If this story reached something inside you, I want you to pause for just a moment and ask yourself honestly, have you ever given everything you had, every last piece of yourself, and been met not with gratitude, but with a clipboard and a procedure? Have you ever been looked at and found lacking by someone who never once thought to ask what you had already carried that day? And have you ever been the one holding the clipboard, when perhaps you should have been asking the question instead? These are not comfortable things to sit with, but I think the most important questions rarely are. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. And if you believe in stories about dignity, about the courage it takes to truly see another person, and about justice that begins with a question rather than a gavel, subscribe to this channel. There are more cases waiting, and some of them will ask even harder things of you.